The autumn of 1944 was cold in more ways than one. Europe was still burning, but the end was finally in sight. Nazi Germany was retreating on every front, its once mighty armies collapsing under the pressure of Allied might. And yet, even as victory approached, a darker uncertainty loomed. What would happen when the war ended? And who would own the peace? At the heart of that question stood two men, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. They had fought the same enemy, but not for the same world. Churchill fought for the survival of democracy and empire. Stalin for the expansion of Soviet power. Between them lay suspicion, admiration, and fear, the makings of an uneasy alliance built on necessity rather than trust. By October 1944, Churchill could feel history racing ahead of him. The Americans were focused on Germany and the Pacific. Roosevelt, increasingly frail, spoke often of global cooperation and the United Nations. But Churchill, ever the realist, saw a harsher truth. Once Hitler fell, the world would be carved up by spheres of influence, not idealism. Eastern Europe, that bloody, restless borderland, was the prize. Poland, Romania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, all were being liberated or occupied by advancing armies. To Churchill, it was clear that unless he acted fast, Stalin's Red Army would decide their fate. And so, in the chill of October, the Prime Minister boarded a plane bound for Moscow. He carried not just papers and briefings, but a desperate idea, one that would become one of the most controversial secrets of his life. As the engines droned above the frozen steppe, Churchill turned to his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, and muttered, "If we don't deal with Uncle Joe ourselves, we'll wake to find half of Europe painted red." He had no illusions about the man he was about to meet, but he had one. Goal: to bargain with Stalin before the Americans could restrain him. It would be diplomacy at its most dangerous. A game, played with history as the stake. Moscow in October 1944 was a city of contrasts, gray skies, red stars, and a quiet that felt more ominous than peaceful. The streets were lined with soldiers in heavy coats, and the Kremlin loomed over it all like a fortress of iron and ambition. Churchill's convoy rolled through its gates under heavy guard. The British delegation was greeted with the usual Soviet stiffness, fixed smiles, sharp eyes, and a pervasive sense that every step was being watched. For Churchill, the setting was familiar yet unsettling. "It smells of power," he remarked to Eden, "and fear." Inside, Stalin waited, pipe in hand, expression unreadable. He greeted Churchill with a curt nod. The two men had met before, but this meeting was different. Hitler was collapsing, and the post-war world was already taking shape. It was a contest between Churchill's charm and Stalin's calculation. The talks began cordially enough. They toasted each other with brandy, exchanged pleasantries about the progress of the war, and praised the heroism of their armies. But beneath the civility, both men were measuring each other, weighing intentions, hunting weakness. Then came the real subject. Churchill opened his notebook, leaned forward, and in his gravelly voice said, "We must not quarrel over the small states. Let us settle their future here and now, like honest men." Stalin's eyes narrowed. He nodded slightly, curious. "Yes, Mr. Churchill, let us." What happened next would remain secret for years, a conversation that would decide the fate of millions. Scribbled on a single piece of paper, Churchill took out a half-sheet of notepaper and with a stubby pencil began to write. Romania, Russia, 90%. Greece, Britain, in accord with USA, 90%. Yugoslavia, 50%. Hungary, 50%. Bulgaria, Russia, 75%. He pushed it across the table. Stalin read it silently, then picked up his blue pencil and drew a small tick mark. A single, quiet gesture that divided a continent. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that feels heavier than sound. The two men looked at each other across the polished table. Between them lay the scrap of paper that would later be called the Percentages Agreement. Churchill later recalled that moment vividly. It was a cold-blooded transaction, he wrote, but necessary to save the balance of Europe. To him it was realism, a gentleman's understanding between giants. To Stalin, it was confirmation that Britain would not interfere with Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. Each believed he had made a shrewd bargain. Anthony Eden, sitting nearby, watched in disbelief. It felt, he later said, like we were dividing the spoils of war, not shaping a peace. But Churchill brushed off his discomfort. "Better to have our say now," he whispered, "than to protest too late." The meeting ended with brandy and laughter. Stalin was in high spirits, his blue eyes glinting behind the smoke of his pipe. Churchill left the room weary but satisfied. "We have a deal," he told Eden on the drive back to the embassy. "It may be unsavory, but it is sound." Yet, even as he said it, something troubled him. That night, back at the British embassy, he looked at the paper again, the faint pencil marks dividing Europe into percentages, and felt a flicker of doubt. "Let us burn it," he said suddenly. Eden hesitated. Churchill smiled grimly. "No, perhaps not. History will judge it." He slipped it into his pocket, folded neatly. It would survive the war, hidden in the Foreign Office archives, and years later, historians would uncover it. A ghost from the dawn of the Cold War. For now, however, it was simply a private understanding, unratified, unannounced but profoundly real. In that one exchange, Britain and the Soviet Union had redrawn Europe's map without a single soldier moving, and the world would live with its consequences for decades to come. The next day, Churchill and Stalin met again, this time joined by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and Anthony Eden. The atmosphere was less formal now, almost conspiratorial. They joked, shared cigars, and spoke bluntly, as men who knew they were shaping something vast and dangerous. Churchill pressed the importance of Greece. "We must keep it," he said. "For Britain, the Mediterranean is life itself." Stalin shrugged. Yes, you may have Greece. We have no interest there." It was an extraordinary admission, one that would later save Greece from communism during its bloody civil war. But the price was high. In return, Churchill effectively conceded Romania and Bulgaria to the Soviet sphere. Stalin leaned back, puffing his pipe. "Each of us should have our friends," he said. Churchill replied, "And each of us must trust the other not to overreach." It was diplomacy by instinct, not law, a handshake over a moral chasm. Behind the pleasantries, both knew what they were doing. Churchill wanted to protect the remnants of British influence. Stalin wanted to secure his western border. It was not ideology but geography that bound them in this grim understanding. As the meetings went on, they spoke less like allies and more like emperors dividing realms. "This is the way the world has always been run," Churchill confided to Eden afterward. "Only now we do it with pencils." But even as he rationalized the deal, Churchill felt a gnawing unease. He had always seen himself as a defender of liberty, yet here he was, bartering nations like poker chips. He justified it as necessity, the cruel arithmetic of survival, but it left a bitter taste. "History will not record the percentages," he told his diary that night, "but it will remember whether we kept the peace." The peace, however, was already fraying. When Churchill returned to London later that month, he carried the percentages paper in his dispatch box, a quiet secret between him and Stalin. Roosevelt had not been told. Parliament knew nothing. Even his own cabinet was largely in the dark. It was diplomacy in its most dangerous form, personal, private, and morally gray. He defended his secrecy to Eden. "The Americans would never understand," he said. "They still think this war can end in idealism, but the world is made of spheres, not sermons." It was the voice of experience and exhaustion. Back home, he resumed the image of the unshakable prime minister, but those close to him noticed a change. He was quieter, more introspective. At cabinet meetings, he often fell into long silences, puffing his cigar as though wrestling with invisible weights. The public never knew, of course. To them, Churchill remained the voice of freedom, But in his mind, a contradiction had taken root, the uncomfortable truth that to save Europe from tyranny, he had bargained with another. At night, he reread the notes from Moscow. He told Clementine, "I have met the devil, and made a deal with him." She said nothing, only nodded. She knew he meant it both literally and figuratively. The percentages agreement was never formalized, never signed, yet it became prophecy. In the years to come, Eastern Europe would fall under Soviet control, just as the paper had predicted. Churchill had tried to contain Stalin. Instead, he had drawn the lines of the Iron Curtain himself. Still, he would later defend his actions. "We must deal with the world as it is," he said, "not as we wish it to be." It was realism. It was survival, and it was the beginning of the Cold War. When Churchill returned from Moscow, the world outside seemed none the wiser. The British press reported fruitful discussions with the Soviet leader, but no one mentioned the scrap of paper that had silently divided Europe. The Prime Minister moved through his duties as though nothing had happened. But behind closed doors, unease gnawed at him. He confided to his private secretary, Jacques Colville, that he felt a little unclean. He had long prided himself on moral clarity, on fighting tyranny wherever it reared its head. Yet now he found himself wondering whether, in outmaneuvering Stalin, he had instead joined him. "If I must choose between principles and power," he mused one night, "then let history judge which serves mankind better." Anthony Eden, always the diplomat, urged discretion. "The Americans would not understand, Prime Minister," he said. "They dream of universal peace. They do not see that peace must first be fenced and guarded." Churchill agreed, reluctantly. "They have hearts of gold," he said of Roosevelt and his advisers, "but the world is not made of gold. It is made of blood and borders." And so, the secret remained between a handful of men. Not even the War Cabinet knew the details. To Churchill, it was not deceit, but necessity. An act of containment before the storm of victory brought new dangers. "We must deal with Stalin as he is," he wrote to Eden, "not as we wish him to be." But silence, like all bargains, carried its own cost. As the Red Army swept across the Balkans, reports began to arrive. Arrests, deportations, puppet governments forming in the ashes of liberation. Each telegram felt like a verdict. The map he had sketched in Moscow was coming alive, not in ink, but in iron, and though no one yet called it the Iron Curtain, Churchill could already feel it descending. Across the Atlantic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was dreaming of a different world. He saw not spheres of influence but a new order of cooperation, a United Nations that would keep peace through diplomacy, not division. To him, talk of percentages and power blocks was a return to the old diplomacy that had caused 2 world wars. When word of Churchill's private dealings reached him, faint hints through diplomatic channels, Roosevelt was displeased but cautious. "Winston thinks in empires," he told an aide. "I think in humanity." It was both a compliment and a rebuke. Churchill, for his part, adored Roosevelt but found him naive about Stalin. "The poor fellow thinks he can charm the bear with honey," he told Eden. "But the bear only respects the hunter's gun." He feared that Roosevelt's idealism would give Stalin the freedom to solidify his grip on Eastern Europe. The tension between them grew, though neither said it aloud. Their friendship, once the pillar of the Allied cause, had become strained by the ghosts of the future. Churchill believed in power politics. Roosevelt believed in moral diplomacy. Both believed they were saving civilization. Both were right, and both were wrong. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, these differences would come to the surface. By then, Roosevelt was ill, his face pale, his energy fading. Stalin, in contrast, was vigorous, confident, and calculating. Churchill arrived determined to protect what he could of the European balance. But the deal he had made months earlier now boxed him in. He could not admit to Roosevelt that he had already agreed to Soviet dominance in Romania and Bulgaria, nor could he undo what he had set in motion. And so he smiled, toasted and negotiated in circles, even as he watched Stalin outmaneuver them both. In his private diary, he wrote, "We have won the war, but not the peace. The shadow of Russia grows long." The Yalta Conference, held in February 1945 in the Crimea, was meant to be a summit of victory. The Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, gathered to plan the final defeat of Nazi Germany and the reconstruction of Europe. But behind the handshakes and photographs lay exhaustion, mistrust, and quiet deceit. The setting was grand but grim. The Levadia Palace, once a royal retreat, now a fortress of Soviet guards and hidden microphones. Churchill, still weary from years of war, felt both triumphant and trapped. "We sit among the ruins," he told his aides, "deciding what shall rise and who shall own it." To the cameras, the three men looked united. In private, the mood was far colder. Stalin, ever the strategist, spoke little but listened closely. He knew that his armies already occupied Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. What he wanted now was legitimacy, Allied recognition of what was already a fact on the ground. Churchill pushed for free elections in Eastern Europe, invoking the Atlantic Charter. Stalin nodded, smiled, and promised cooperation, a promise that everyone in the room knew he would not keep. Roosevelt, visibly frail, clung to optimism. "If we can't trust each other after all this," he said, "what hope is there for mankind?" Churchill said nothing. In the evenings, Churchill and Roosevelt shared brandy and weary jokes, but even those moments felt hollow. "The old magic is gone," Churchill confided to his doctor. "We once shaped history. Now we are being carried by it." When the conference ended, the communiqué spoke of unity and peace, but Churchill knew the truth. They had signed not the birth certificate of peace, but the will of Europe's freedom. Stalin had outplayed them both, and Churchill's secret percentages deal had given him the perfect excuse. Back in London, he told his cabinet, "I fear we have sown the wind." History would soon prove him right. In the months that followed Yalta, Churchill watched with growing alarm as Stalin's promises dissolved into propaganda. Soviet troops stayed in the territories they had liberated. Puppet governments rose overnight in Bucharest, Sofia, and Warsaw. Dissenters vanished. Newspapers were silenced. Elections became theater. By the summer of 1945, it was clear Eastern Europe was not free. It was Soviet. The lines Churchill and Stalin had once drawn in pencil were now fixed in barbed wire and fear. The percentages agreement, meant to preserve balance, had become the blueprint of domination. From the House of Commons, Churchill warned of the danger. "An iron curtain," he said privately, "is descending across the continent." The phrase would later echo across history, but at that moment it was only a whisper, the lament of a man watching his own compromise turn to tyranny. The tragedy was personal as well as political. Churchill had thought he could contain Stalin through understanding, through the gentleman's code of power politics. But Stalin had no code, only calculation. To him, the percentages agreement was a license, not a limit. Anthony Eden, haunted by guilt, admitted as much years later. "We believed we could fence in the bear. Instead, we showed him the boundaries of his new cage, and he filled it." Churchill never publicly confessed regret, but those close to him saw it in his eyes. When asked about Moscow in 1944, he would grow silent and change the subject. Once, over dinner, he said only, "I thought I was saving Europe. I was only postponing her next torment." The West would later call it the Cold War. To Churchill, it was something far more personal, the unfinished business of a deal he had made in a moment of desperation. After the war, Churchill's role changed, but his thoughts never left Moscow. In 1946, when he delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, he was finally giving voice to what he had long feared. "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic," he declared, "an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent." It was his confession disguised as prophecy. The Americans were startled. Stalin raged. Yet the truth was undeniable. The secret map he had drawn with Stalin's tick now stretched across half of Europe in military occupation and communist regimes. The world was dividing again, and this time, not even victory could bridge the gap. In private, Churchill told friends that the speech was the hardest thing I've ever done. Not because of fear, but because it forced him to admit, publicly, what he had helped to create. The very darkness he had tried to manage had now swallowed half the continent. Historians would debate for decades whether Churchill's deal was cynical or necessary. Was it moral compromise, or the realism that kept the balance of power from collapsing? The truth lies somewhere in between. He had faced a world of wolves and done what he thought best to save the flock. But in doing so, he had fed the strongest wolf of all. He never destroyed the scrap of paper from Moscow. It remained in the Foreign Office archives, brittle and yellowing, a relic of the moment when the post-war world was born not with treaties, but with percentages. Politics, Churchill once said, is the art of the possible. But in that room in Moscow, what was possible had come at an impossible price. For years after the war, the percentages agreement remained hidden, a secret buried beneath official communiques and speeches about unity and peace. Only a few men knew it existed. Churchill mentioned it once obliquely in his memoirs, calling it a small slip of paper that settled several points. Most readers passed over the line without understanding its weight. But in the British Foreign Office, the document still lay locked in a classified file, its pencil marks faded but legible. Romania, Russia 90%, Greece, Britain 90%, Yugoslavia 50-50, a list of nations reduced to fractions of freedom. By the 1950s, as the Cold War deepened, those percentages looked prophetic. Eastern Europe had become the Soviet bloc. Greece had narrowly escaped communism, saved only by Britain's fierce intervention during its civil war, just as Churchill had insisted in Moscow. The balance he had tried to strike was holding. But at what moral cost? When researchers finally stumbled upon the document in the archives years later, they were stunned. It was not the kind of artifact that belonged to the age of democracy and liberation. It was something older, almost medieval, a private division of the world between two men. One scholar described it as the most naked act of realpolitik since the Congress of Vienna. To many, it confirmed their darkest suspicions, that the Great War for Freedom had ended not in moral triumph, but in pragmatic partition. To others, it revealed Churchill's brilliance as a strategist, a man who saw the Cold War coming and tried, in his own ruthless way, to manage it before it began. But for Churchill himself, it was a ghost that never quite left him. In his final years, as he painted the tranquil ponds at Chartwell, he once said to a friend, "There are things one must do in war that do not bear daylight, but without them the dawn may never come." By the time Churchill left office for good in 1955, Europe was no longer the battlefield of armies. It was a chessboard of ideologies. NATO and the Warsaw Pact faced each other like watchful sentinels, and somewhere between them ran the invisible boundary he had once sketched in pencil. He often spoke of the Iron Curtain not as prophecy, but as penance. "I tried to warn them," he said, "but it was too late." What he rarely admitted was that he had helped draw its first faint line. The irony was as sharp as it was tragic. Clementine, ever his moral compass, once asked him if he regretted Moscow. He paused, his cigar smoldering between his fingers. "I regret that I was right," he said, "because being right brought no comfort." He was not alone in his guilt. Anthony Eden, who later became Prime Minister, confided privately that the deal had haunted him for decades. "We thought we were saving Europe from chaos," he said. "We were only defining her prison walls." Yet Churchill never saw himself as a villain, only as a realist in a world that rewarded ruthlessness. "Better to make a hard peace," he said, "than to let a soft one collapse into war." In that, perhaps, he was justified. The uneasy peace of divided Europe lasted for nearly half a century. The Cold War was cold, but it was not another world war. Still, there was no triumph in that. He knew that the children of the East lived behind fences he had once drawn to save them. That thought never left him. "We saved the body," he once murmured, "but lost the soul." In the 1960s and 70s, as historians began to unseal wartime archives, the percentages agreement surfaced at last. Newspapers published it with disbelief, a handwritten note, a few short lines, and Stalin's unmistakable blue tick. The public reaction was immediate: shock, outrage, fascination. Many saw it as proof that even the heroes of the good war had made deals with the devil. Others defended Churchill, arguing that he had acted in the only way possible, given the brutal realities of 1944. "It was not cynicism," one historian wrote, "but desperation, the diplomacy of survival." The revelation reignited debates over moral leadership. Could a statesman claim to defend liberty while bartering away the liberty of others? Was Churchill's compromise a betrayal of ideals, or the only way to preserve them from total collapse? Churchill, of course, was long gone by then, but his words remained. In his wartime speeches, he had often said, "I have not become the king's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." Yet in Moscow, he had quietly presided over the liquidation of something larger, the hope that all of Europe might share the same dawn of freedom. And yet, time softened the outrage. As the Cold War matured into its strange stability, many came to see Churchill's bargain not as treachery, but as foresight. He had not caused the divide. He had recognized it early, and tried to contain it before it consumed the world. It was a grim comfort, but perhaps that was all diplomacy ever offered. Comfort measured in the lesser of evils. Decades after Churchill's death, the lines he drew in that Moscow meeting still scarred the world map. Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and the rest of Eastern Europe lived under Soviet rule until the late 1980s. Generations were born and died behind the curtain of his compromise. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, it was as though the ink of that old paper had finally washed away. In London, journalists revisited the story of the percentages agreement, marveling at how one quiet evening between two men had helped shape the second half of the 20th century. In hindsight, historians began to ask a subtler question. Was Churchill's moral compromise the reason the Cold War stayed cold? By recognizing Soviet influence early, he may have prevented direct confrontation. In trying to divide Europe on paper, he may have stopped the world from dividing in blood. Still, the paradox endured. The same man who declared that the British would never surrender had surrendered half a continent to tyranny, in ink, if not in arms. Yet perhaps that was Churchill's final lesson, that even victory demands a price, and the higher the cause, the deeper the debt. At Chartwell today, the painting he left unfinished, a soft landscape of light and shadow, feels almost symbolic. One half in sunshine, one half in shade, a fitting reflection of the world he left behind. Time, as always, became the final judge. In the cold light of history, the percentages agreement stands as one of Churchill's most unsettling legacies. Neither pure cynicism nor pure pragmatism, but something achingly human, a choice between right and survival. For his critics, it was proof that even great men could compromise their ideals. For his defenders, it was proof that greatness sometimes requires it. The truth lies between, in that gray realm where politics and morality collide. Churchill once said, "Meeting Stalin was like being alone in the room with a cobra. You watch the flicker of its tongue and pray it doesn't strike." In Moscow, he had faced that cobra and survived, but the bite came later. In the world his deal helped create, and yet his intentions were never small. He believed he was buying time for Europe to recover, for democracy to strengthen, for freedom to find its way back east. In that sense, perhaps his gamble worked. It took 40 years, but the Iron Curtain did finally fall. The same West that he fought to protect outlasted the empire that had replaced Hitler's tyranny. When the secret paper is studied today, creased, yellowed, still bearing Stalin's faint blue checkmark, it feels less like a betrayal than a warning. It reminds us that even the defenders of freedom must sometimes navigate darkness. Churchill never glorified the act. He only once alluded to it, years later. One must make the best of the world as it is, not as one would have it. But one must never stop wishing it better. In that sentence lives the contradiction and the genius of the man himself. A man who fought for liberty, bargained with tyranny, and in doing so, defined the world that followed. The percentages were just numbers. The consequences were history.